am happy to be at Franciscan University to talk about Martin Luther King and his personalism today, one of a number of intellectual foundations of his thought and his practice. Unlike many people, Martin Luther King was not interested in ideas for the sake of ideas or for the sake of being able to articulate them in a way of displaying his intellectual acumen. Ideas were important for Martin Luther King only because of their substantive bearing on making the most of human beings, most specifically those counted among the forgotten and the left out, those forced into the muck and the mire of the margins of life with no lifeline and virtually no hope or relief in sight. So when we think of Martin Luther King as a man of ideas and ideals, we need also to remember that he did not pursue these merely for the sake of pursuing them, but because of what they could mean for making better, just, and more gentle human beings and structures, as well as a better, more gentle world. Those who studied and understood the philosophy of personalism as it was taught and developed at Boston University in the early 1950s knew that it was being practiced by the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association during the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, which began in early December of 1955. Douglas Moore, a student acquaintance of King's at Boston University, wrote to him on October 3rd, 1956, to cheer him in his role in the boycott and to say what he was doing in Montgomery was consistent both with radical Christianity and the philosophy of personalism. The sense was that personalism in its truest form is a doctrine that one lives and practices more than she teaches, preaches, or writes about. Although there is no evidence that Claiborne Carson and the King Papers Project at Stanford University have located a response to Moore's letter, we can be certain that Martin Luther King, a recent recipient of the PhD degree in systematic theology from Boston University, was pleased and encouraged by Moore's having called attention to the connection between Christianity and personalism and the work being done in Montgomery. Personalism, the oldest extant American philosophy that still has a following, albeit small, would have meant nothing to Martin Luther King had he not seen and believed that its basic principles demands that proponents apply them in efforts to make better persons and to achieve the beloved community, a term that the absolutistic personalist Josiah Royce introduced philosophically in his book, The Problem of Christianity, in 1913. Although I want to talk with you about King and personalism, it is important that you know that by the time he finished college, he was already committed to finding a formal theological rationale for his already very strong social conscience, as well as a method for addressing and eradicating racism and social evils that crushed the humanity and threatened the sense of dignity in his people. I want you to get the distinction being made here. The sense of dignity can be crushed or even destroyed in human beings, but not dignity as such, particularly for those like Martin Luther King who believed that the God of the Hebrew prophets and Jesus Christ is the source of human worth, by virtue of being imbued with the image of God, indeed, of being the image of God. Every human being has inviolable dignity. To be a human being is to possess this fundamental dignity which is neither given by human beings nor can be taken away. For to be a human being is to be the image of God, and thus to possess infinite, indestructible dignity. That a person or group is treated unjustly and inhumanely does not mean that they are without this fundamental dignity, no matter how much it may be assaulted by the actions of others. It is surely the case that efforts are frequently necessary to recapture the sense of dignity. But to be a human being is to possess such dignity even if one is not aware of it, and many people aren't. As a boy, Martin Luther King promised his father that he would do all he could to help him to fight against racism and injustice. In order to achieve this goal, he read voraciously and studied relentlessly in seminary and graduate school, having been an average student at best in college. By the time he matriculated at Crozer Theological Seminary, his social conscience was already mature, and he was an advocate of the social gospel Christianity long before he read Walter Rauschenbusch's classic book, Christianity and the Social Crisis. There were already signs that whatever theology or philosophy he made his own would have to be one that focused on sustaining and enhancing the infinite worth of his people in particular and all people in general. In addition, it would have to be a theology or philosophy of militant engagement, of attitudes and individual and institutional practices that undermined human dignity. Martin Luther King's personalism may be defined in terms of radical engagement, respect, and love for persons. Because of his focus on the absolute dignity and worth of the person, King's fight for justice for his people and other oppressed people was grounded in the more fundamental principle of the sacredness of persons. Persons are more important than rights and justice, but these are necessary for the enhancement of human beings. One does not merely fight for justice and for rights. One fights for the justice and rights of human beings. King's personalism is not a system, but is more closely related to a movement based on making the most of persons, most especially those with their backs against the wall, to use Howard Thurman's phrase. Kingian personalism is a way of being, of living and relating in the world based on mutual respect, appreciation, and love for the image of God, which is us. It is what one does. Personalism is what one does to make better persons and a better world. Now, I want to do several things in this presentation today. First, to briefly define the meaning of personalism. Second, to discuss the relation between Christianity and personalism. Third, to discuss briefly what I characterize as the homespun contributions to King's personalism. And fourth, to list and briefly discuss 5 key personalistic ideas in the mature thought and thinking of Martin Luther King. What is personalism? Borden Parker Bound, who lived from 1847 to 1910, was the father of American personalism, having been called to head up the philosophy department at Boston University in 1876, where he remained until he collapsed in the classroom and died on April 1st, 1910. In personalism, we find the best and the worst in idealism, I'm afraid. Its emphasis on God as person, the dignity of persons, and the centrality of freedom I consider to be among the best that it offers. However, early personalism's emphasis on mind as the only ontological reality, I consider among the worst that it offers. On one hand, that stance implied that only God and human beings are metaphysical realities. In addition to the question about what may be ontologically real beyond persons, early personalism left one wondering about the relevance of the body. Metaphysically, what seemed to be of importance were the spiritual aspects of the human being. The body, on the other hand, seemed to be little more than an inconvenience, a shadow of the real person. Proponents of this truncated form of idealism often spoke and wrote as if the body was not at all essential to what it means to be a human being, since what is really fundamental is the mind or inner self. Not unlike some of his personalist forebears, Martin Luther King himself was guilty of holding such a view in graduate school and early in his civil rights ministry. For example, in his sermon, The Dimensions of a Complete Life, he said to the congregation, "You look at me and you think you see Martin Luther King. You don't see Martin Luther King at all. You see my body, but you must understand my body can't think, my body can't reason. You don't see the me that makes me me. You can never see my personality." Such a statement implies that the body was not significant for Martin Luther King, although we know that it was most significant to him, and that he was quite careful to point out in many places that the body is not only significant, but is also sacred. In this regard, he said, that means in any doctrine of man that we must be concerned with man's physical well-being. Why focus, I wonder, on the well-being of the body if it is not significant? Influenced by the social gospelism of his father, maternal grandfather, and other black preachers, and Walter Rauschenbusch, none understood better than Martin Luther King how important it was to focus on the well-being of the whole person, body and spirit. The reason he could tell his congregation that when they looked at him, they didn't see the real king was because of his uncritical adherence to the type of idealism extending from Plato to Bound, and yet in his writings on ethics, Bound himself was without peer in stressing the inherent dignity of the whole person. In the simplest and broadest sense, one might say that personalism is any philosophy that takes mind or personality to be the ultimate reality or principle of explanation, while also stressing the inherent and absolute dignity of human beings. The first part of this description is important because it means that even the atheist can be a personalist, as was the case of John McTaggart, who taught that personalism is the ultimate reality. Of course, Martin Luther King believed firmly in a personal God and thus was a theist. Therefore, it would be reasonable for the theist to define personalism as the philosophy that God is personal and is the supreme reality and value, and that persons possess infinite and inalienable dignity. The type of personalism to which King ascribed is essentially a metaphysic, maintaining that reality is a society of interacting selves and persons with a supreme person, God, at its center. A world of persons with a supreme person at the head, said Bound, is what we come to with this type of personalism. Indeed, we come to the idea of a supreme rational will, which forever founds and administers the order of the world. More explicitly, and in King's own words, personalism means that there is a creative personal power in this universe who is the ground and the essence of all reality. For King and his personalist teachers at Boston University, personality is the fundamental principle of explanation, capable of explaining all principles but itself. Just think about this. In order to do any explaining or any discoursing at all, one has to assume the existence of mind, intelligence, or personality. This is why it is not uncommon for personalists to speak of personality as the assumption of assumptions or as the master principle. For it is that principle without which other principles do not matter or can be known. Personality on this view is the supreme philosophical principle, which means that in the quest for reasons, in the quest for causes for things, one must seek their explanation in mind or personality. Personalists maintain that personality is the key to the mysteries of the world and the universe, or there is no key. What is important for our purpose is the emphasis that personalism places on personality or mind. It is significant metaphysically because its reference is to that which is thought to be the ultimate explanation of things, namely a personal God. But it is also significant ethically, inasmuch as it says something about how persons ought to be treated by virtue of being persons. For if personalists are right in their claim that persons possess inherent and inalienable dignity, it follows that they ought to be treated accordingly. A word about Christianity and personalism. It was not difficult for Martin Luther King to find the path to personalism. After all, he had grown up in a staunchly Christian home, and his father, maternal grandfather, and great-grandfather were ministers. What he was taught and what was modeled for him at home and at church confirmed for him that Christianity at its best stressed four things. One, the value of persons as beings of supreme worth. Two, the value of the world. Three, the value of life itself. And four, the importance of working to enhance, to increase, and to sustain value in the world. It was unknown to the boy King and those who taught and modeled basic Christian principles for him that these were also basic elements of the philosophy of personalism. Consequently, by the time King first heard the term personalism, quite possibly during his student days at Morehouse College, was introduced to its basic ideas at Crozer Theological Seminary, and then studied it systematically at Boston University, he was already in the personalist camp, had grown up with some of its basic ideas, but did not know it at the time. The later mature Martin Luther King would not have disagreed with Albert C. Knudsen's claim that personalism is par excellence the Christian philosophy of our day, or John Wright Buckham's stance that it can hardly be gainsaid that Christianity has closer and more complete affiliations with personalism than with any other philosophy. Its theory, as well as its very life, is bound up with the emphasis on the person and personal values as related to man and God. For both Christianity and personalism, the central feature is personality. When we think of Martin Luther King as personalist, we need to remember that he adhered to a particular type of personalism, for there are at least a dozen types, including but not limited to the atheistic personalism of John McTaggart, the absolutistic personalism of Mary Calkins, the realistic personalism of Georgia Harkness, the theistic personalism of Borden Parker Bound, and what I have called African American personalism. As a seminary and doctoral student, King was introduced to and studied the theistic personalism of Bound and Edgar Sheffield Brightman, was much influenced by it, and by his own admission, took it as his own philosophical stance. By being vigilant and rigorous in applying the basic principles of the Bound type of personalism to the civil rights movement, King unwittingly helped to forge African American personalism, a thoroughly social activist personalism that requires that one be unswervingly committed to struggling against social injustice. The method that King used, of course, to fight injustice was nonviolence. Indeed, King was without peer when it came to consistently applying the principles of personalism to the hot cauldron of the civil rights movement. In this, he went well beyond his personalist teachers at Boston, applying and testing personalist ideas in the struggle for social justice gave King's personalism a much different texture and look. Indeed, King was truly the quintessential social activist personalist. Although a man of ideas and ideals, he was a social or applied philosopher in the best sense. The personalist Jacques Maritain, who King wrote papers on in seminary and during doctoral studies, characterized the applied philosopher in a way that Martin Luther King would have approved, saying, "The philosopher cannot, especially in our time, shut himself up in an ivory tower. He cannot help being concerned about human affairs in the name of philosophy itself and by reason of the very values which philosophy has to defend and maintain. He has to bear witness to those values every time they are attacked, as in the time of Hitler, when insane racist theories worked to provoke the mass murder of Jews. The philosopher must bear witness by expressing his thoughts and telling the truth as he sees it." But King went well beyond this, bearing witness not only by speaking truth to the powers, but by consistently putting his body in the line of fire in the pursuit of justice. Indeed, King's personalism was closer to that of Emmanuel Bonnier and that of the Catholic worker personalism of Dorothy Day and Peter Morin. In any case, we need to be mindful at all times that Martin Luther King was the proponent of a particular type of personalism, the characteristics of which will be discussed momentarily. A brief word about the homespun contributions. Now, I know that it is Friday afternoon, it's the end of the week and all of that, and it's near the end of the semester and all of that, and folks are tired. I know. I am too. So it's important that you try to stay with me, though, nonetheless. And I not only chide you, I chided my students on yesterday in my last class with them as well. It was a very difficult time for them to sit through the lecture, John, but oh, thank you very much. All right. That's good. Okay. All right, homespun contribution. I want now to give some brief consideration to personalist ideas to which King was exposed during his family and church upbringing. although there are a number of personalist ideas that King was exposed to during this period, I here name and examine but three of them. One, the dignity of persons. Second, the idea of God as creator and as personal. And thirdly, self-determination and the obligation to protest injustice. I then turn to a consideration of basic ideas in the mature King's thought. The absolute dignity of persons. Most people who are familiar with King's upbringing are aware of the incident involving he and a childhood playmate who happened to be white. As preschoolers, young King and the boy played regularly together and enjoyed each other's company very much, as children are wont to do. When they reached school age, the boy's parents forbade the two to play together. When they began to make excuses about why their son could not go out to play, young King inquired as to why. The reason given was that he was a Negro. Confused and devastated, he told his parents about the incident, and they in turn had the painful and really the impossible task of trying to explain what was behind the incident. In a word, they had to give him a lesson in the history of race relations in the United States, as if any of this could make sense to a 6-year-old boy. And yet, it was the only reasonable thing that loving parents could do. So King's mother placed him on her lap and told him about the history of the enslavement of his people and the remnants of that tragedy in the form of racial discrimination in the South and the rest of the country. Mrs. King also told and impressed upon her son that because the Kings were Christian people, it was not permissible to hate others because of the color of their skin or because they were themselves full of race hatred. The Christian ethical imperative of love required that one return love for hate. His mother then told him what most black parents were compelled to tell and to instill in their children: you are as good as anybody. A point that was regularly reinforced by both of King's parents as well as the maternal grandmother who lived with them. The point of Mama King's talk was to awaken and to strengthen the boy's sense of somebodyness and the sense of the God in him, as reflected in the concept of the Imago Dei. His mother told him that he must never allow racism and discrimination to cause him to feel inferior. Because he was a child of God, indeed the image of God, he was deemed sacred and precious to God. This was Mama King's real message to her child. As might be expected, the boy could not understand how in the world it was possible to love people who hated him solely because of the color of his skin. Looking back many years later, King said that he was determined to hate all white people, and that this attitude did not begin to subside until he enrolled at Morehouse College at age 15 and joined an interracial organization called the Intercollegiate Council, where he discovered that not all white people were like the parents of his boyhood friend. King reflected that his involvement in this group convinced me that we had many white persons as allies, particularly among the younger generation. I hope that's the case today, too. I had been ready, he said, to resent the whole white race, but as I got to see more of white people, my resentment was softened and a spirit of cooperation took its place. To have been loved by his parents and reminded throughout his childhood that he was a child of God, that he was somebody, and that he was as good as anybody, made it easy later on for Martin Luther King during the formal and intellectual training to accept the personalistic idea of the absolute dignity and worth of human beings as such. God as personal and as creator. Martin Luther King recalled that while growing up, he and his siblings spent so much time in church that it was like their second home. This means that they received heavy and frequent dosages of fundamentalist Baptist teachings in Sunday school and worship and youth groups and other church-related activities. In addition, the King children were required to recite Bible verses at the dinner table. This was supplemented by frequent Bible storytelling by their live-in grandmother, Jenny Celeste Williams. They would have learned much about the fatherhood of God and the love of God through these stories. Reinforcement of these and related religious teachings was provided by their parents and extended family members. From the religious training received both at church and in the home, King learned much about the God who was the creator and sustainer of all there is. As seen earlier, he learned from his mother that he was somebody because he was created and loved by God. This connection to God was the source of the absolute dignity possessed by every human being. In addition to learning about God as creator, King also learned from his church and home teachings that the God of Christians is personal. While growing up, he would not have understood this philosophically, but religiously. The religious sense of God as personal has more to do with individual relationship with God than with the philosophical meaning of a personal God. While growing up, King learned from the Bible that each individual has her own personal relationship with God, in the sense that God has numbered every hair on her head and knew her by name even before God summoned her into existence. Because God calls every person by name, each belongs to God and thus has her own special relationship with God. Religiously, young King knew that every person belongs to the God of the universe, as he read in Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 4. Which means that there is one supreme parent of all people. This latter idea has strong implications for the unity or solidarity of human beings as one family under God, as well as the interrelatedness or relational character of all life. King would have learned all of this through religious teachings in the home, through Sunday school lessons, and through his father's sermons. God is personal in the sense that each person is unique and special to God and can have his own unique relationship with God. While growing up and prior to entering college, King would have known nothing about the idea of God as personal and that it was related to the philosophy of personalism, because he learned much through teachings in the home and at church about the religious meaning of God as personal. This made it possible for him to easily and comfortably adopt the personalistic view of God as personal during his formal academic training. The importance of self-determination and obligation to resist injustice. This third homespun personalistic idea is also a prominent theme in King's family lineage. The staunchly religious members of King's family did not, like many of their white counterparts, separate religion from socio-ethical behavior. According to the King family lineage, to be religious actually affected how one lived one's life and required that one resist social evil and injustice inasmuch as these undermined the importance of human dignity and God's expectation that justice be done in the world. Early on, then, King developed a sense of personal responsibility for self and others, as well as what was happening in society, a trait that would be included in his social activist personalism. King's paternal grandparents, James and Delia King, were not disposed to uncritically and silently enduring injustices against them, and especially against their children, without resisting, even violently. When King Jr.'s father, Daddy King, was growing up in Stockbridge, Georgia, a white mill owner beat him one day when he was on an errand for his mother. When he returned home in bloodied condition, his mother confronted the mill owner, managed to take him to the ground, literally, and beat him about the face mercilessly, declaring that anybody who harms her children will answer to her. Now this, of course, was a very dangerous move on Delia King's part during that period of time in the Deep South. For her to have even looked at the white mill owner a certain way could have led to her own or the flogging or lynching of other members of her family. Nevertheless, her action revealed her willingness to protest such mistreatment, even violently, regardless of the possible consequences. Now, when James King, the father, heard about the incident, he got his rifle and went looking for the white mill owner. Martin Luther King Jr. obviously did not inherit the nonviolent spirit from his paternal grandparents, but he did inherit from them the spirit of the obligation to protest injustice and social evil. King's maternal grandparents, Adam Daniel, or A.D., and Jenny Celeste Williams, also protested social injustices, but only through nonviolent means. When the newspaper editor of the Georgian made derogatory comments about Atlanta's black community, many blacks wanted to burn down the building. Reverend Williams, pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church and president of the local chapter of the NAACP, insisted that violence was not the way. Instead, Williams first met with the editor, who insulted him, refused to issue an apology, and demanded instead that he leave his office. Williams then called a meeting of black pastors and organized a boycott of the newspaper. The intention was not to destroy the company. The intention was to get a public apology for the derogatory statements made. The apology was not forthcoming, and within a few months, the Georgian went out of business due to the boycott. Now here we have an instance of both the spirit of protest and the appeal to nonviolence as the means to addressing injustice. Consequently, we can say that the spirit of the protest of injustice was prevalent on both sides of Martin Luther King's family, but that the spirit of nonviolence was present only on the maternal side. Historically, the belief in God as personal and as loving creator caused blacks to believe that Christians have a moral obligation to resist collective evil. What is important for our purpose today is that each of these three themes, the conviction, that every person is an heir to a legacy of absolute dignity by virtue of their relatedness to God, that God is personal and creator, and that human beings are morally obligated to resist social injustice are fundamental religious themes that made a deep impression on the boy king, causing him to be amenable later to the formal teachings of the philosophy of personalism. Now, a word about the mature king's personalism. In this final section, I briefly consider 5 of the basic traits of king's personalism: belief in a personal God, significance of freedom, absolute dignity, again, persons as relational beings, and finally, the conviction that the universe is value fused and under a loving purpose. These are all basic tenets of the type of personalism to which Martin Luther King adhered: belief in a personal God. King's personalism and his Christian faith assured him that there is a creative personal power in this universe who is the ground and the essence of all reality. His words. What precisely did King mean when he referred to God as personal? He generally spoke and wrote about this in both philosophical and religious terms. When King wrote or talked about a personal God philosophically, he was without question influenced by the personalist Bound. Nowhere is this clearer than King's distinction between what he characterized as his earlier philosophical conception of a personal God, that was, his words, little more than a metaphysical category that he found theologically and philosophically satisfying, and the personal God of his faith, who, as a living reality, was present in his day-to-day struggles during the Montgomery bus boycott and beyond. Philosophically, he wrote, I am convinced that the universe is under the control of a loving purpose, and that in the struggle for righteousness, man has cosmic companionship. Behind the harsh appearances of the world, there is a benign power. To say that God is personal is not to make him a finite object besides other objects or attribute to him the limitations of human personality. It is to take what is finest and noblest in our consciousness and affirm its perfect existence in him. It is certainly true that human personality is limited, but personality as such involves no such limitations. It means simply self-consciousness and self-direction. So in the truest sense of the word, God is a living God. In him there is feeling and will, responsive to the deepest yearnings of the human heart. This God both evokes and answers prayer. This description clearly reflects King's reading of Bound's book, Personalism, when he was a doctoral student at Boston University. In that text, Bound wrote, the essential meaning of personality is selfhood, self-consciousness, self-control, and the power to know. Any being, he said, finite or infinite, which has knowledge and self-consciousness and self-control is personal. For the term, Bound said, has no other meaning. By definition, then, corporeal or physical attributes are not part of the philosophical meaning of personalism. Consequently, Bound writes what we also see reflected in King's statement: in thinking of the supreme person, we must beware of transferring to him the limitations and the accidents of our own personality, which are no necessary part of the notion of personality, and think only of the fullness of power, the fullness of knowledge, and the fullness of selfhood, which alone are the essential factors of personality. Indeed, in his 1956 sermon entitled Living Under the Tensions of Modern Life, Martin Luther King reflected on the meaning of a personal God, saying that the Christian religion talks about a God, a personal God, who is concerned about us, who is our Father, who is our Redeemer. This is a God, he said, who can think, who is self-determined, who has a purpose, and who can love, which means that God meets the philosophical criteria for being personal. Now, having found this way of thinking about God as personal to be philosophically satisfying, during his student days, King discovered early on in the civil rights movement, in Montgomery, in fact, that this was not fulfilling and did not provide the trust and comfort needed for the dangerous work in which he was engaged. King reflected that somehow Plato's notion of God as the architectonic good, or Aristotle's unmoved mover, or Hegel's and Spinoza's absolute whole, or Tillich's being itself, or Henry Nelson Wyman's process of integration, or Whitehead's principle of concretion. None of these characterizations of God quite provided the comfort and the sustaining power that he needed in order to do life-defying civil rights ministry. The threats to his life and that of his wife and children from Montgomery onward caused him to draw closer to the God of his faith. King had always believed in a personal God from the time he was a boy, but before the movement work, it was mostly in an intellectual sense. With the threats to his and the lives of his family and the bombing of his house in Montgomery, he needed the God that his parents and his maternal grandmother told him about. This all came to a head for the young minister one late night after just a few weeks into the bus boycott. King had gone to bed. It was late, and just as he was about to doze off, the telephone rang. Now, as King remembered it and told the story, he said, an angry voice said, "Listen, nigger, we've taken all we want from you, and before next week, you'll be sorry that you ever came to Montgomery." He had received numerous similar threats before, but that particular night was too much. He couldn't get to sleep. So he did what many of us would have done. He left the bedroom and he began to pace the floor. King tells us what happened next. Finally, he said, I went to the kitchen and I heated a cup of coffee, pot of coffee. I was ready to give up. With my cup of coffee sitting untouched before me, I tried to think of a way to move out of the picture without appearing to have been a coward. In this state of exhaustion, with my courage all but gone, I decided to take my problem to God. With my head in my hands, I bowed over the kitchen table and prayed aloud. The words I spoke to God that midnight are still vivid in my memory. I am here taking a stand for what I believe is right. But now I'm afraid. The people are looking to me for leadership, and if I stand before them without strength and without courage, they too will falter. I'm at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I've come to the point where I can't face it alone. At that moment, he tells us, I experienced the presence of the divine as I had never experienced him before. It seemed as though I could hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, stand up for righteousness, stand up for truth, and God will be at your side forever. Almost at once, he said, my fears began to go, my uncertainty disappeared. I was ready to face anything. Now, in a later version of this incident, commonly referred to as the kitchen table experience, King said that as he paced the floor, he tried to no avail to get comfort from some of the philosophers and theologians he had studied in school as he tried to make sense of the existence of sin and evil. At any rate, it is quite likely that the experience at the kitchen table is what led to King's overwhelming sense of trust and dependence on the God of his faith. But this could only happen once he humbled himself to the point of admitting that he had come to the end of his own resources and was ready to trust God fully and completely. His faith had to become real for him. He had to know God for himself, not through the experiences of somebody else. This was the God that his parents and maternal grandmother told him about when he was a boy, the personal God who he would now depend on for the rest of his life. King found that he could not say about his philosophical conception of a personal God what he could say about the personal God of his faith, the God he discovered at the kitchen table. About this God, he could say, God has been profoundly real to me in recent years. In the midst of outer dangers, I have felt an inner calm. In the midst of lonely days and dreary nights, I have heard an inner voice saying, lo, I will be with you. When the chains of fear and the manacles of frustration have all but stymied my efforts, he said, I have felt the power of God transforming the fatigue of despair into the buoyancy of hope. King had discovered the God who was not only personal, but the great and enduring companion who cared, to paraphrase Whitehead, reflecting on the Christian God as personal companion. King said he reaches out with his long arm of compassion and love and embraces all of his children. He gives life a meaning and a purpose that it could never have without him. But there is more, as King went on to say, and this sense of religion and of this divine companionship says to us, on the one hand, that we are not lost in the universe, fighting for goodness and for justice and are all by ourselves. It says somehow that although we live amid the tensions of life, although we live amid injustice, no matter what we live amid, it's going to be, not going to be that way all the time. King became convinced that those who really know God for themselves can comfortably speak poetically and religiously about God as a way of acknowledging their feeling of absolute dependence. In the sermon, Why Jesus Called a Man a Fool, King illustrated the point, saying, you begin to know that our brothers and sisters in distant days were right, because they did know him as a rock in a weary land, as a shelter in the time of starving, as my water when I'm thirsty, and then my bread in a starving land. And then if you can't even say that, sometimes you may have to say he's my everything. He's my sister and my brother, my mother, and my father. If you believe it and know it, you never need walk in darkness. This was the personal God of Martin Luther King Jr.'s faith, which was more meaningful and comforting to him on the treacherous civil rights trail. The significance of freedom. Are y'all still with me? Okay, it won't be long. I'm coming home. I'll get there. Okay, all right. When King talks about freedom philosophically, one easily hears the influence of Boyden Parker Bound, who King read and studied in the course on personalism that he took under L. Harold DeWolf during his doctoral studies at Boston. In the final examination for that course, King described Bound as the forthright champion of freedom, which was his most characteristic emphasis. He acknowledged that for Bound, freedom had both epistemological and ethical significance, that without freedom, both reason and morality would be shipwrecked. Years later, in his speech, The Ethical Demands of Integration, we again find King talking about freedom in ways that unquestionably revealed the influence of Bound. Discussing the nature and significance of freedom, King said, the very character of the life of man demands freedom. In speaking of freedom at this point, I am not talking of the freedom of a thing called the will, he said. The very phrase, freedom of the will, abstracts freedom from the person to make it an object. And an object, almost by definition, is not free. But freedom cannot thus be abstracted from the person, who is always a subject or subject as well as object, and who himself still does the abstracting. So I am speaking of the freedom of man, the whole man, and not one faculty called the will. Now, it is not freedom of a freedom of a faculty called the will that was significant for King, but the freedom of the concrete flesh and blood human being. The freedom of the whole person who actually deliberates, chooses, and ponders the most foreseeable consequences of decisions made. Apart from his final examination in the class on personalism, King did not cite Bound in his discussions on freedom, and yet Bound's ideas were present. For example, Bound also rejected the idea of an abstract freedom existing by itself, even though King did not acknowledge this, that is, that it was actually Bound's idea. In addition, freedom for Bound was thought to be the power of self-direction in human beings, a view that King made his own. For Bound, and again similar to King, freedom was not merely a question of ethics, but of reason or rationality as well. Without freedom, both ethics and reason are impossible. There can be no ethical responsibility without freedom, nor can there be a distinction between truth and error. King accepted Bound's view that our faculties are actually made for truth. Therefore, the only way to account for error is to use our freedom to choose it. According to King, freedom means essentially three things: the power to deliberate or weigh alternatives, to come to decision, and to be responsible for the decision or choice made. Again, this is not much different from Bound, who said that freedom is the power of self-direction, the power to form plans, purposes, ideals, and to work toward their realization. For Bound, as for King, freedom is something of the vitamin A of what it means to be a person. Indeed, it would not be far-fetched to say that to be is to be free. To be free is to be a human being. King, in fact, espouses a very similar view to this when he approvingly quotes Paul Tillich saying, "Man is man because he is free." Another word about absolute dignity. Martin Luther King accepted implicitly the personalist view that human beings are both the highest in the animal world and the children of the highest, made in God's image. There is no unanimity of agreement as to the precise meaning of the imago Dei, or image of God. Suffice to say that it has been interpreted in terms of fellowship, responsiveness, reason, and conscience, expressions of human beings' higher spiritual nature. King fleshes this out when he says, man is more than flesh and blood. Man is a spiritual being born to have communion with the eternal God of the universe. God creates every individual for a purpose, namely to have fellowship with him. This is the ultimate meaning of the image of God, said King. It is not that man, as he is in himself, bears God's likeness, but rather that man is designated for and called to a particular relation with God. Because all human beings are imbued with something of the divine, all are equal in intrinsic worth. For King, the theistic personalist, held that the relatedness to God is what gives each human being her uniqueness and her dignity. This is what King meant in his sermon, The American Dream, when he admonished the nation to remember and to never forget that there are no gradations in the image of God, he said. Every man, from a treble white to a bass black, is significant on God's keyboard, precisely because every man is made in the image of God. God made us to live together as brothers and to respect the dignity and worth of every man. Every person is endlessly precious to God, a point that King tried to convey when he quoted the scripture, "There is joy in heaven over one sinner." This, he held, is precisely why we must resist and fight against racism and segregation and every other attitude and practice that alienates and separates human beings from each other and from God. We need also to remember that when personalists such as Martin Luther King talk about the dignity or the sacredness of human beings, the reference is not merely to the spiritual side of their being, but to the whole person, mind, spirit, and body. God calls human beings into existence as ensouled bodies and as embodied souls, so that on this side of the grave, at least, we are at once and always a spiritual and biological being. Because both are thought to be the creation of God, both are intrinsically good. This is a view that could have come straight out of the book of Genesis, as a matter of fact, where we are told that all that God created is good. The body is not inherently evil, but it's sacred because created by God. To King, this meant that when fighting for the freedom of the human being, one fights not merely to free his soul or his spirit, but his body as well. One fights to eradicate anything that demeans the human being. In personalism, as in Christianity, the body is not the principle of evil. It is sacred. Persons as relational beings. I'm not kidding you. I'm coming. I'm getting there. I am. We have seen that theistic personalism maintains that reality is a society of interconnected selves and persons with God, the supreme person, at the center. Such beings are dependent on, but not a part of, God. And for the very good reason that were the human being literally a part of God, that would be the end of individuality as well as moral responsibility. God would be responsible for all moral acts. At any rate, according to personalism, the basic structure of experience is social or relational, a point that critics of personalism often miss. Indeed, Brightman himself argued that for personalism, reality is social through and through. Every personal experience includes something which the person did not invent or create, but which he received from his interaction and communication with other persons. For personalism, then, social categories are ultimate, which would seem to imply that God is a relational creator who has created a relational universe. Now, Martin Luther King pointed to the interrelatedness of human beings and communities throughout the world in his famous letter from Birmingham jail. He also stressed the indivisibility of justice and deplored the idea that any community, any place in the world exists in isolation. Instead, he declared, we are caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one affects all, directly or indirectly, emphasizing the idea that human beings are made to live together because of the interdependent quality or structure of reality. King gave the concrete example of how we humans are dependent on people in other parts of the world. In a Christmas sermon on peace, preached in 1967, he said, "Did you ever stop to think that you can't leave for your job in the morning without being dependent on most of the world? You get up in the morning and you go to the bathroom and you reach over for a sponge, and that's handed to you by a Pacific Islander. You reach for a bar of soap, and that's given to you at the hands of a Frenchman. And then you go into the kitchen to drink your coffee for the morning, and that's poured into your cup by a South American. And maybe you want tea, that's poured into your cup by a Chinese. Or maybe you're desirous of having cocoa for breakfast, and that's poured into your cup by a West African. And then you reach over for your toast, and that's given to you at the hands of an English-speaking farmer, not to mention the baker. And before you finish eating breakfast in the morning, you've depended on more than half the world. This is the way our universe is structured," he said. "This is its interrelated quality." That he had such strong empirical evidence of the communal nature of experience served only to strengthen King's belief that reality is fundamentally relational or social. He was convinced that until we acknowledge and take seriously the interrelated structure of the universe and what this means for human relations, peace and justice will not prevail in the world, and it has not. Moreover, this led him to the conviction that he could not be what he ought to be if the next person is not what she ought to be, and vice versa. God made the world this way. King was clearly arguing against an I-centered sort of ethic and in favor for a we-centered one. This, he was convinced, is more consistent with how the universe is structured and functions. If all life is truly involved in a single process, as King believed, then whatever is done to Sally is done to me. Injustice to gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, and queer people is injustice to heterosexual people. Injustice anywhere, King loved to say, is a threat to justice everywhere. He saw this as consistent with his conviction about the interrelated structure of reality. And finally, the conviction that the universe is value fused. And I actually think that if one does not get this principle and its meaning, that there is no way that one can claim to really understand Martin Luther King's theology and social ethics. I mean, I think you got to get this one. The conviction that the universe is value fused. Martin Luther King was always reminding his audiences that there is something basic, something fundamental about the universe that justified his conviction that the universe itself is on the side of justice and righteousness, that at the end of the day, good will triumph over evil, that the words and deeds of racists and segregationists will not have the last say, that one dies morally when she fails to stand up for justice. Noting the similarity to Christian principles, King said, "This belief that God is on the side of truth and justice comes down to us from the long tradition of our Christian faith. There is something at the very center of our faith which reminds us that Good Friday may occupy the throne for a day, but ultimately it must give way to the triumphant beat of the drums of Easter. Evil may so shape events that Caesar will occupy a palace and Christ a cross. But one day, that same Christ will rise up and split history into AD and BC, so that even the life of Caesar must be dated by his name. This is but a reminder to human beings that God ultimately rules history, and thus the forces of evil and injustice cannot survive. Cannot survive ultimately, Mark. They have in our lifetime, but ultimately they cannot survive. Martin Luther King lived by the faith conviction, not demonstrable proof, for it can neither be proved or disproved, that there is something at the core of the universe that supports the claim of the 19th century abolitionist preacher Theodore Parker that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. That supports the claim of the Bible that you reap what you sow, the claim of Thomas Carlyle that no lie can live forever, the claim of William Cullen Bryant that truth crushed to earth will rise again, the claim of James Russell Lowell that truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, but behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. This was one of Martin Luther King's most frequently repeated mantras. Such a stance led King to the conviction that goodness and love, justice, are at the core of the universe. For any who believes this, there is reason for hope. To believe that love, justice, and good will ultimately triumph means that every seeming defeat is only temporary as long as one persists in trying to overcome it. To believe that God is the source of love and justice and good is to also believe that one has cosmic companionship as she fights for justice in the world. Personalism holds that it is right that all things should support the goodwill on its way to doing what is just and right. The moral government of the universe means just this, and among other things, said Bound, that all things are working together to secure for the goodwill the perfect life that it seeks. Martin Luther King himself declared on many occasions that God has created the universe such that it hinges on a moral foundation, and that there is a law in the moral world, a silent, invisible imperative, akin to the laws in the physical world, which reminds us that life will work well in only a certain way. The Adolf Hitlers and the Mussolinis have their day, declared King, and for a period they may wield great power, spreading themselves like a green bay tree, but soon they are cut down like the grass and wither as the green herb. Not unlike his personalist forebears, Martin Luther King believed deeply in the existence of objective moral laws on which all human or civil laws should be based. Bound had this in mind when he wrote, "Back of both the individual and the collective will is the fixed nature of things, the moral law, the natural rights of the person, and the constitution of the objective world. And all that men or nations do must finally be referred to these as their warrant and their foundation." Because Martin Luther King believed with Bound and with other personalists that the moral law is an expression of God's will, he was adamant that it applies to all people everywhere and that it cannot be mocked or defied without severe consequences. In his sermon, "Our God is Able," King declared as much when he said that God has placed within the very structure of this universe certain absolute moral laws. We can neither defy nor break them. If we disobey them, they will break us. The forces of evil may temporarily conquer truth, but truth will ultimately conquer its conqueror. God bless you for this moment. At least I am finished, John.